Good morning, everybody that's in already. We can probably just give it another 2 or 3 minutes or a minute or two just to let the last few join. I can see them joining at a rapid rate. And then we'll start with the presentation. All right, so welcome to the next tech talk of GridCars. The idea is that we are going to start looking at doing this more often, where we do a little bit more of a technical talk around how the different technologies work and where they're going. Today's one is going to be very focused on the network itself, the charging network across the country. And the idea would be to just take you through firstly what's out there and make you aware of that, with the idea that we are seeing a lot of people that are not aware of it. I've met people on the road who've bought an EV and they didn't know that there was a network, and they've driven halfway to Cape Town. So the idea is to try and get that information out and to spread the news and get everybody to know it. A little bit of housekeeping when we start. Firstly, special thanks to Monet and Rose. They'll be producing everything in the background. So Monet, you might hear talking a little bit later, and Rose really just sets it all up for us, and really great professional services on that side. Thank you for attending. It's great to have such a big group to hear about what's happening with EV charging in South Africa and what the network looks like. The talk will be available afterwards. It'll probably take a couple of days, but we'll get it up onto YouTube and we'll send you all a link that you can share it like that. And I will be, while I'm talking, if there are burning questions, please put them into the chat session. Don't be afraid to type in the chat. You can ask questions there. If they're small questions, you might already have people answering them. But the idea would be that we can then, whereas we'll answer the rest of them at the end of the session. We've got a new polling system that we're going to be testing. So it's the first time we're doing the polls, but we'll run a few polls and you'll be able to answer. Basically, the poll will pop up on your screen and you're literally just going to have to click and say, this is what my vote is, or this is what I'm looking at. And then finally, as of 8 o'clock this morning, and I think it has changed quite substantially since then, and that is that 67 people were registered for this talk. Of that group, 41 were EV drivers. So I'm very proud to be hopefully the only person or the first person to speak in South Africa where more than half the people attending a webinar are actual EV drivers. So currently we're at 61%. We will of course publish the exact number once we're done with the thing. We've seen who all joined finally. Just a single introduction slide just quickly about GridCars for those who don't know. So GridCars operates really in 4 areas. The first thing is we're a charge point supplier. So we supply AC or DC charging stations. We don't have 5 or 6 different versions of each one. We typically have 1 or 2 models in each of the categories. And those are the systems that we both install ourselves when we put out networks, but at the same time, we use them for customer networks as we go forward. We're a charge point operator, so we manage networks on behalf of customers. So if a customer is looking at rolling out a charging network, we'd look at helping them manage that network, ensuring that their charge points are maintained and that they have high uptime with those services. We're an e-mobility provider. We work typically in the e-mobility space. We're working with the OEMs themselves. And the idea is that this is the billing and the back end of the management system. So the part that will allow you to take your card and just tap your card on the charging station, and everything happens transparently in the background. Finally, we do invest in the network, and we'll talk a little bit about that network and where those networks are as we go forward today. Just a quick little reminder of where people are thinking this can go. I'm the first to admit this is an optimistic view, but you know, I've seen projections that are even more optimistic than this. And if you look carefully at that line, that sort of shows that we'll completely phase out fossil fuel engines before 2030. So this is really where the drive will go. I'm a strong believer that this is going to happen much, much quicker than what the general view in the market is. If we look back 5 years and we look at the positions that the OEMs are taking now and the levels that we're at, we're completely outperforming those numbers. So where people were thinking that by 2021, 2022, this is what the numbers would be, we're close to double it in certain areas. So we really are doing well in terms of how that adoption goes. And it's obvious because the technology is just so much better. So it's really a case of understanding how do we adopt to this change or adapt to this change. It's not as much about saying, will this happen? We know it's going to happen. The question is really how we're going to change our businesses, how we're going to change our habits, how do we change our move towards the battery and the electric vehicle industry. So we're going to test the polls first up. So Monet will get our first poll up for us. And the first poll is, have you done an EV road trip? So just give us some idea for the people who've actually gone out there and driven, because part of our objective is to convince you to try it if you haven't. So, you know, if you've never driven one, then it's the first one. If you do less than 500 kilometers, then you do a 500 kilometer. If it's around 2,000, or if you've done really long trips and you've done more than 4,000 kilometers, just vote. So you'll see on the screen now, you can see the question is there with all the choices. Just pick a choice and say submit, and we'll give you the results pretty much once we're done with that. And for those who've left to get coffee, then you might miss that. When we did the registration, we asked everybody to just give us a question that they felt was a burning question from their side. What happened with that is we took it, we summarized it, we went through it, and we used the questions to direct a lot of the slides and the information that I will talk about as we go forward today. But these were sort of the big topics that came up. The first thing was, what are the types of charging and charging speed? So I'm going to talk a little bit to that as we go on. Types of connectors and connected charging, so or connectors. The technology evolutions. One question was, you know, what are you doing to prevent the changing of technologies with your existing network? Because we're rolling out network, and not just us, other people are rolling out networks, and the technology may well change underneath us. There were lots of questions around growth. In fact, I'm going to say a third of all of the questions were around the growth of the network and a little bit about the coverage of the network. So GridCars originally took the perspective that we first have to build coverage on the network. We don't really need to build density. So what we want to try and do is get chargers everywhere, as broad coverage as possible. Once we have that coverage, the numbers will speak for itself, and we can then look at how do we adjust the density. Obviously, we would love to put down 10 chargers at every single site everywhere across the country. I think all the EV drivers would have loved that as well. But in a practical world, there are limits of budgets, there are limits of access to sites, and there's just practical limits of where we should be doing, how we should be spending that investment. So from that perspective, our first objective was get good coverage across the country. The second objective would be to look at that and to start to increase that, let's just say, more and more opportunities at each site, so that we start to give a little bit more reliability on that. Charging habits. There were quite a few questions around charging habits, and it's very simple. You know, my feeling is you charge at every opportunity you get. When you stop your car, if there's a place to charge it, you plug it in and you charge it. There's no magic formulas. There's no, you know, you should charge at this time, or charge once a week, or charge when you get to that level. It's very simple. You plug it in when you can. The idea is that when you get into your car, the car should be full. And I've experienced that so many times, where every time I get into my car, it's pretty much full because I use that opportunity. There was one question around the impact on batteries, and I think it's important to say that when the OEMs quote you on a battery, it's already on the assumption that those batteries are going to be fast charged. So if you do not fast charge, it will have a small impact on the battery. The battery will last a bit longer. It's the same as if you but if you don't use a battery at all, it'll also not last as long. So you really do need to use the battery, and fast charging doesn't massively change the life of the battery. Bad charging habits will change it, and those bad habits, somebody once said to me, and I'm almost sure he's on the call, but I won't pull his name out, and that is that he said that batteries don't like to be empty for a long time or full for a long time. So if you're going to go overseas for a month or two, put your battery at 70 or 80%. Don't leave it 100% full. If you arrive home late at night and the battery is almost empty, don't leave it stand overnight. Plug it in immediately and get it full, that by the next morning you've got a bit of power in that battery. And then the last one is that the integration of renewable energies, and we'll talk a little bit about as the presentation goes on. All right, so very quickly, AC versus DC charging. The real difference is that AC is the charger portion sits inside of the vehicle, whereas the part on the outside of the vehicle is It's a clever switch. It's an intelligent switch that will monitor what's going on and manage that. These are typically cheaper systems, and they're slower. They take quite a bit more time in terms of charging. DC systems, definitely more expensive systems, but charging times can be much quicker. I was asked by somebody recently where they said a particular manufacturer of charging stations had claimed that they can now charge all cars in 15 minutes. And once I had a look at it, there was only one car in the entire world that they could charge in 15 minutes, because the restrictions are not just on the charger, they're often on the car itself. So some cars may only be able to charge up to 50 kilowatts. And even though you've got a 300 kilowatt charger, you can only charge at 50 kilowatts. So you do need to understand a little bit about both the charger as well as the vehicle side of what you're looking at. When we talk about AC systems, again, not all AC systems are equal. The idea is that we're starting right at the bottom, and we're going to call it a 3 kilowatt charger. Anybody who does drive an EV will know that it's probably more like a 2.8 kilowatt charger. And these are the chargers that come in the vehicles normally for emergency use or for occasional use. So they're really, really slow, but they're very universal, and they help you out of many, many situations. As we move up to 16 amp charging, which is 3.7 kilowatts, 32 amp charging, which goes to 7.4 kilowatts. And then we move on to the 3-phase systems, which do 11 and 22 kilowatts. So these are much faster. You would need more power at your home. So, and then just on the actual connector side of it, there was a couple of questions about saying what connectors will happen, what's going to happen with CHAdeMO. So this is a slide. In fact, the picture that's embedded there that you see that was done by ABB is a slide that comes from about 2009. And you often find this quoted in presentations where people say, oh, it's sort of it's a war between the two different plug types, and this is where it's, they equally, one might win, this one might win. So the reality today is that, and even the cars that are still listed under CHAdeMO, the last time I actually looked this up was about a year ago, because we've pretty much for the last year, everybody knows this is the end game, is we're going with CCS. CCS is the standard. CCS charging can get up to probably 300, 400 kilowatts in terms of power. And with the new specialized cooling of cables, they're really pushing those limits of where that goes. I don't think we're going to see a massive plug change in the short term. So from that perspective, if you're betting on a plug, you bet on CCS, and that's typically the standard that we'll be going forward with. To try and address quite a few of the questions that just came around the technology. So the first thing is battery swapping. I'm not going to spend time on this. It ain't going to happen. And you can go and read about projects like Project Better Place. We struggle to get OEMs to agree on a single plug type or on a single voltage for that matter. Now, if you're doing a battery swap, now you've got them to agree on everything, including the physical infrastructure, the performance of their vehicles, the cost of their vehicles, everything comes into that. So I really can't see battery swapping being a viable technology for vehicles. For scooters, maybe. Absolutely, we might see it in that space. Vehicle to grid. So what is the likelihood of that happen? I'd say medium likelihood. Impact relatively high to the home itself, because your charging equipment will become much more expensive. So we're seeing vehicle to grid systems today. We could sell you a charger already that has vehicle to grid, and I'm pretty sure all the other manufacturers, or at least the other suppliers in the industry, could do the same. And the problem is it's probably 4 to 5 times the price of a system that is not got vehicle to grid. The vehicle to grid debate is not over, because there's implications on the vehicle. For example, the vehicle is not doing kilometers, but you're using the battery. So is the battery warranty still in place, etc.? And there's a lot of questions being asked around how this can be done. So I think we'll see some level of vehicle to grid capabilities about 3 to 5 years from now. Demand response in terms of connecting into utilities and working with utilities, I think the likelihood of seeing this is really high. The impact is low. It's just how we manage our charging and smart charging systems. And we'd probably see, there's certainly no work being done at this time, but I would think within the next 2 to 3 years, we'd have to see this in the industry. Smart charging. Smart charging is something that people bat around as, oh, wow, this is where we might go. But in reality, most of the mainstream chargers are already doing smart charging. Unless you're buying a real entry-level system, you're probably going to have some level of smart charging capabilities in the chargers. Certainly most of the DC charging systems would at least have, they're future-proofed for charging. Faster charging, yes, there's a high likelihood we would see faster charging than what we currently have. The impact would be high. It's not high, the impact is not high on the existing network. The impact is high on the sites that must supply this energy. And it'll be high on how we've got to evolve those sites by putting down solar, supporting them with battery, etc. So, and readiness, yep, it can already go. We can already do charging systems over 300 kilowatts in terms of power. There's nothing new about it. I think, again, most of the technology is available in the market already. Wireless charging is another interesting one. So there are definitely wireless technologies coming. I would think it's in the sort of 5-year span before we'll see it commercially available. Pricing wise, it still has to come down and be more competitive on the pricing side. It doesn't radically change the hardware infrastructure, because if the power is delivered via a DC system, then you still need the power electronics of the DC system. So you're changing the plug and the wire. So there would be some level of retrofit that could probably be done on various charging stations to accommodate a wireless option. Cardless charging is absolutely coming. We will see it within the next 2 years in South Africa. Most of the chargers that have been deployed in South Africa are already ready for this. They normally would refer it to as ISO 15118 ready. The impact to the industry would be relatively low. It just means we don't use a card. We're not authorizing the vehicle as it connects. So there's a lot of talk around solid state batteries. And I know Toyota released something about a week ago where they put out a vehicle that's driving on solid state. But once you start reading into it, even Toyota is saying it's probably 6 to 8 years away from having something that they think is commercially viable. There's a lot of, let's just say from the OEM side, I think there's a lot of view to say this could be the big thing. But when we look at the researchers coming out of the universities, etc., they're very cautious to promote where this can go and how fast it can go. So there's many challenges still to overcome before we can go into production on that side of it. Hydrogen fuel cell technology, again, the likelihood of it coming in is low. Maybe I should say that differently. I think a very small percentage of the industry would go towards fuel cell technology. The impact would be low simply because there would be so few of them in the industry. And the readiness is, we're actually quite ready for it. Fuel cell technology started in the 1940s. So we know what the technology is about. It's really just, it's not a very practical solution because it sort of is more complex than the fuel station. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to evolve forward with our technology that we have a simpler system for refueling, not a more complex system. There's a lot of articles talking about nuclear and diamond and lithium air batteries, etc. And I think these battery technologies, I'm very impressed by what I've seen around the diamond technology, or at least diamond batteries, or let's call it diamond encased nuclear batteries. But they're going to be for pacemakers. They're going to be very, very, very low power, low energy. They'll last a long time. They'll last for 50 or 100 years. But they're never going to be delivering vehicle level powers. That's not what we're seeing. These are low power systems that can be used in spacecraft that are traveling far away and those sort of things. And then the last one is charging on road sections. So there's a lot of talk around this. I think the likelihood is medium, maybe. Impact would be high to the existing infrastructure because we charge very differently at that stage, but we're certainly as much as 10 years away from seeing something practical. And then once you start looking at home charging, what's quite important is these chargers are pulling a lot of power. So a good home charger would pull very close to the same amount of power that you use in your home on a daily basis. So that would mean that we're sort of doubling the power. So if we're very close to the limit of your consumption, if you look at the, let's put my little cursor on here. So if you look at this, here's the limit of our power. We're running on the green line, and suddenly something like a washing machine switches on. You're likely to exceed that green line and trip the charger. So what smart charging would do is if you're running along that green line and something like a washing machine switches on, the charger would step down so that you're totally still the green line, that you maintain that. And most home chargers can handle this. And if you're installing a charger at home, it's the first question you should be asking the installers is, does this do, is this smart? What is the level? How do I configure it? how do we work with that? I want to throw up the next poll while we're waiting, and that would just be, do you have three-phase power at your home? Part of the reason for this is a lot of times we're asked questions as, should we be able to do DC fast charging, or can you do a three-phase charge, which is 11 or 22 kilowatts? So the question is, do you have three-phase? Just gives us some sort of idea about where we stand with that. And then the last point I want to make on this size is important. So we are going to see vehicles moving towards higher voltage systems. And the reason why is because as you have a bigger battery and you want to be able to charge that battery fast, you would need much, much higher amperage. So if you want to charge a large battery using, let's say in this case, we want to do a 200 kilowatt charge rate, and you've only got 420 volts available, you're sitting at about 475 amps. Whereas if we can take the voltage up to 800 volts, we can bring the amperage down to 250. And amps is the size of the cable. So it gives you some sort of indication here of how big a cable would be if it had to carry 475 amps versus 250 amps. So it's really, as we move to bigger and bigger systems for faster and faster charging times, we will see higher and higher voltages within the vehicles. Personally, I don't really think we'd see a lot going well over 1,000 volts, but certainly up to 1,000, that's where we would definitely see changes in the technology. And then as we look, I want to just very quickly cover how the electrical side of charging would evolve. So the first thing is, we get our power from the grid. Basically from the grid, it goes through a transformer, it hits a meter into your distribution board. And then if you're going towards a charger, we go to an isolator, into the charger, and finally into a car. So to just give you a run through how we look at then optimizing things like this. At the very first level, we look at smart charging, and smart charging really does sit between the vehicle and the charge point itself. So the vehicles themselves have capabilities within them to set when do you charge, how often do you charge. You can set to only start a charge late at night, etc., so that you can stay outside of, let's say, the peak times or costly times. Certainly those exact same smart capabilities move onto the charging stations, and the charging stations can be aware of the site. They can be aware of what power is available at the site, and they can also adjust their power based on that. So that's where the smart charging starts on the right-hand side. As we move up in the power, when we want bigger and bigger systems, we're going to have to start looking at battery boosting or local buffering to be able to support the charging network. To go further than that, and you want to start to put down solar at the site, then you can look at your battery at a site level, not necessarily at a charger level, and the battery can support the site in general, but you can then do all sorts of things like energy arbitrage. You can do balance your energy better. You can start looking at how do we use the battery to save money as we move forward. Certainly solar is really the way to go in the long term. We should be using solar as far as possible, and solar integrated into the entire opportunity. So within the building, within the property, that's where the solar should be, and the charging is part of that structure. I don't foresee that we'll see a lot of places where we're going to put down charging just for the charger. Maybe in 5 years' time, that's where it goes. As we move beyond this, if we really need much more power at a site for a lot of charging infrastructure, we've got to start to look at actually increasing the municipal connection. So having bigger transformers and bigger connections into that. And of course, in South Africa, that may be quite a challenge. So we'd first look at localizing the support of the infrastructure. All right, so what does the national network look like in South Africa? So I'm going to these are other network operators. This network, I'm going to call it for the sake of the discussion, it's network 1. This is not a GridCars network. So you can see the distribution of that network across South Africa. It's a mixture of AC and DC systems. In total, about 400 kilowatts of DC, and I think that's sort of the important part of this. So this particular network has about 2.8 megawatts installed, and 400 kilowatts of that is DC power. There's a second network in South Africa. They've done about 800 kilowatts installed, and their DC portion is only about 90 kilowatts. So it's a much smaller DC component to theirs. And then there's the GridCars network. So that would be the 3 biggest networks in the country. There are a lot of other networks with 2, 3, 4, 5 chargers in them. So on the GridCars network, we've installed 4.1 megawatts that we've installed. but 3,000 kilowatts of this is DC. So the vast majority of the power that GridCars has installed has been DC charging along the major routes on the highway. Remember what I said in the beginning, our objective was coverage. So this was part of a coverage strategy to try and get as much as we can. So if the next slide is going to just bring all of those together. So if we now overlay all of those charges on top of each other, that's what it looks like. So that's the South African network across all major networks in South Africa, not only the GridCars charging stations. So one of the questions that we often get is around urban density. So how many chargers are there in certain urban areas? So to start off with, again, network one, we've been anonymous on this. You can see they've got relatively good coverage across the Johannesburg area and Pretoria. So this is Joburg, Pretoria area. The second network that we're showing has got less of a footprint across those two areas, but nonetheless still very good coverage. And then the last one is the GridCars network, and you can see we're not a dominant installer in the urban areas. Again, we went for coverage. So the idea was to get as much coverage on highways as we could, not necessarily massive coverage in the cities. But you will see that strategically we always do have DCs in each of the major cities. So you can see those on this drawing. So if I take all of those and I put them together, anybody who says there's no charging infrastructure in Johannesburg really just hasn't had a good look at the mapping and the things that are out there. And hopefully by the end of today, we'll be able to give you a little bit more information that you can convey this message out to friends, family, customers, and show them how much charging really is in this network across the country. Just a slightly different look quickly at the urban density. So this is a tool that GridCars has developed that allows us to look at where chargers are placed. So the little black splodges are the chargers, and the white area is an area in which you're never more than 10 kilometers away from a charging station. So if you look there, you can see pretty much the whole of Joburg is available. You're never more than 10 kilometers away from a charging station. And I had somebody say to me the other day, but where do we install chargers? Well, it's quite easy. Look for the red areas, and that's where you should be installing chargers. If we move on to Pretoria, a very, very similar scenario. You can see where that lies within that. And then down to KZN to have a look at the KZN network. Again, remember, this is never more than 10 kilometers away from a charger. So you can see right up to Ballito and down to Durban and out to Pietermaritzburg, actually, there's charging technology all across that area. The Western Cape, also on a 10-kilometer line. Now, because Cape Townians like to drive a lot, so we decided we'd also just give you the 20-kilometer view. So watch carefully, you're going to see a change. This is 10 kilometers, and there's the 20-kilometer view. So in Cape Town, never really more than 20 kilometers. Where's a great place to install a charger? Absolutely down there in Mitchell's Plain and those sort of areas, because I can see lots of red down that area. But this gives you some sort of idea of how the chargers are distributed across the country. If we just step it out and I'd use the same tool, but just make it 120 kilometers from a charger, that gives you some sense of where the chargers are across the highway. And the red areas would be the areas where we need to start looking at expanding. Remember, 120 kilometers away from a charger is relatively close. So with cars that have ranges of upwards of 300 and 400 kilometers, then you'd be quite comfortable making most of these distances as we go along. So then to look at the actual routes across the highway, to try and cover some of those and give you some, let's say, where can we go for a holiday? One of the questions actually was, when will the charging infrastructure be at such a point that we can go on holiday? Well, we would like to say that that was already the case in 2019. So you really can go on holiday with an EV, and many, many people have done that in South Africa. So the first one is Pretoria down to Durban. And I'm not going to read through each of them. What I want to just highlight for you is that there's no gap along that highway that is more than 158 kilometers. There's our maximum one. So most EVs can make this very comfortable. The bigger EVs or the EVs with larger batteries, they can even choose which stations they're going to skip. They don't have to stop everywhere. And there will be more, we know, of charge points. They're going to be coming up on this highway that will be enhancing that. Just gives some idea of how much there is on that N3. If we move on to the N4, so really this is looking at Rustenburg to Nelspruit. Again, biggest gap on that section, 185 kilometers. So you really could drive all across the N4 from Rustenburg all the way to Nelspruit, and then certainly go a bit further north and go and visit Kruger and enjoy our national assets. Down to Cape Town. So now we're starting to look at the big routes, and of course we're going through the little Karoo where there's not a lot happening. And here we do have our first potential challenging segment, which is 313 kilometers. Now we're talking systems like the bigger cars, no problem still. So your I-Paces and e-trons and Mercedes, they'll all be fine. Whereas some of the older vehicles, or they have smaller batteries, they might want to struggle with that one. So what we do have is there's an alternative, and that alternative is quite simple. Just go via Middelburg and Graaff-Reinet, and you're going to be fine all the way down. So without a doubt, though, there is already plans in process to look to closing that gap and fixing that. Might happen hopefully before December, but it certainly is already happening on that section of the highway. But this is the scenic route, and it gives you an extra 100 kilometers to drive, but certainly absolutely worthwhile. I saw somebody said no charges yet in the Northern Cape. I completely agree, and also no cars in the Northern Cape, but it's coming, and we are certainly looking at opportunities to expand into that direction as well. And then the last one that I'll just give a bit of detail on, and that is the N2, so basically Cape Town to Port Elizabeth. I know there was a question on the original questions asking about Port Alfred, and hopefully we address that in the next slide or two. So I hope that by now you've started to get a feel for where you think chargers should go. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you the chance that you can be somebody working for GridCars, and your job is to decide where would the next DC fast charger be installed in South Africa. So if I said to you there was a charger, it's standing in the workshop, it's ready to go, we need to find a site, you need to give us where you think it should be. We're going to give you a list of places we think is a reasonable next charger to be put down. But if it's not on that list, I'm going to ask you to please type it in the comments. So if you think the most urgent DC charger has to be at this address, please put it in the comments so that we know about it, that we can have a look and see whether that's really practical, that we can do something like that. So we're going to do a poll, and that poll will give you some fairly extensive choices. You can see what they are there. And while the poll is being displayed, I'll quickly just run you through what our view was on these. So a lot of these positions are just big gaps in the existing highways on the main N1s, N2s, N3s. When I say a big gap, they're gaps that are more than 200 kilometers. So where we're looking to say we need to get something that people can choose and say this is where it'd be much better. So if you can please go through, look, pick a charge point or two and say this is the ones we'd like to see done next, and we can then have a look and see how practical is that. And for Carl, there's your Port Alfred one, so please by all means select Port Alfred, and you're welcome to use the chat to try and convince other people to vote with you if you're looking for a good site in Port Alfred. So from an overall perspective, again, we definitely don't have a lot in the Northern Cape. Of course, there are a couple of challenges with that. One, there are not a lot of EVs in that area. The second thing is that it's a very remote area, which means that we can often go 200-300 kilometers without finding a place to install a charger. So it's going to be very challenging to look at getting the actual sites and the actual locations as to where you can put chargers down in that section. And once you activate a highway, one of the things GridCars learned in the early days was that claiming to have a highway between Cape Town and Pretoria, if just one of those chargers is down, we don't have a highway. The highway is out. So we learned a very hard lesson, and well, hard in the sense that it took a lot of effort on the team and to ensure that we have a really, really high uptime. And we've achieved massive leaps and strides, I want to say, where we're sitting with average uptimes above 98% of the network. And that's critically important when we don't have density. So as we start to expand this network and as other operators start to put more and more chargers down, we'll improve on that density. And as we improve the density, then certainly a single charger doesn't become as critical on the lines. Obviously, from GridCars perspective, our objective would always be to retain a high uptime, even if there is good density of charging infrastructure. As I said, about a third of all the questions were related to network growth. So firstly, we will continue to invest in the network as GridCars. We're relatively strategic. I'm going to say strategic in that we're still looking to create coverage. We don't want to go and put down a second DC charger 2 kilometers away from where we've already done a DC charger. Density is important, and I think that will come over time. The next thing is we do need more cars in the market. So a big part of what we're working with is really around adjusting public perceptions, that people can understand this. It really concerns me when I encounter someone out on the road who's been on the road for a week and he hasn't realized that there's a charging network. And believe me, it happens. It really happens. People are taking their vehicles out, not knowing where those things are. And that comes down to communication through the dealerships, that the dealerships are not fully communicating to the customers. It comes down to us, making sure that we get out there more, that we do talks, get videos out, make people aware of how broad this infrastructure really is. And we need people to use the infrastructure. The more you use the infrastructure, the easier it's going to be for us to see, now we can expand, we can improve the density in this area. You know, I love it when people post pictures where these three cars standing at the same charger in a queue. It hasn't happened often, but we've had about 5 or 6 incidences over the last year. And that's great because that's giving us an indication of where we should be going. There are many new investors entering this market. Rubicon is driving a big AC network that they're putting out across the country. Breve is doing the same. They're putting AC networks into various areas. So we're going to see more and more technology coming out like that. Most of the fuel suppliers are now stepping up and looking at what do they need to do, how they're going to be expanding their forecourts. Property developers are making this part of their strategic plans. It's great when architects call and say, how do we plan for this? What do we have to put down? What is the technology? What do we have to allow for? How do we manage this going forward? And at the end of the day, we need the EV drivers. I can say that on this meeting because 61% are EV drivers. And that is, we need you to go out there and create that demand. We need you to give us the suggestions and motivate where you want those sites to be. And not just to us, to other people, to talk about it, put it in social media, say, wouldn't it be great if there was a charger over here? Because that will influence the property developers. It will influence people who want to buy and people who want to work with these things. And finally, if you really want to put a peg in the ground, you can go to that bit.ly link. It's GCCPV, which stands for Charge Point Voting. And you can actually do a vote. They will put the link into the chat section, but you can register there. You can put down charges. You can motivate why you want a charger there. And we use this as a guide for when do we need to expand and how do we expand that network. So the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about the charge pocket. This is how we do charging. So the first thing is that the actual starting of a charge at a charging station is relatively easy. So what you'll do when you get to the charging station, the first and most common way is you would literally plug in your car and tap an RFID card. And once you tap that RFID card, that will give you it'll start the charging session, and ultimately you'd be able to then monitor on your app. And I'm going to show you how that works. I'll show you a live demo of that in the next minute or two. The second thing is you can also just scan the QR codes that are at the charging stations. So once you scan it, it'll open up a link, and that link would go through to our server, and that would start the charging station for you. You can also send a WhatsApp message, and basically the WhatsApp message is what you see on that sticker down the bottom. You see it says charge and a code, which is the charging site that you're at, and that would start the charge at that charging station. Finally, you can also use the app itself, so you can start the charge within the app, and I'll show it to you now, or you can call into our call center and you can ask them to start the charge for you. Of course, if you're using your dad's car or maybe using your son's car, then when you get to the charging station, you can phone the person who has the app and they can actually connect and do a remote start for you at the site that you're at. So just to quickly get up my tech, if you can excuse a second. Okay, so what you've seen on the screen now is actually my phone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the Charge Pocket app. Charge Pocket app is this little thing that you see over here. There it is there. So if I click on that, it opens up the Charge Pocket. And what you can see there is you can see firstly how many tokens you have available in your account. So that's at the top. You can see what you've used in this particular month, in this year. And if you have any vouchers, you can see the vouchers on it. And you can also then see what your charge transactions have been. So this just shows my latest charge transactions and any messages that were sent to me. So it gives me a relatively nice overview of what's happening within the charging side. If I need to load money, and this is often people say, oh, but it's hard. Well, really, there's a little dollar sign down in the bottom left-hand corner. And if I click on the dollar sign, it's going to open up and it defaults to 200 Rand, but I can change the amount and I submit. All I'll have to do is add in my credit card details and it'll literally move the money into the Charge Pocket account. This is a prepaid account at this stage, but I must stress, we are in discussions where we will probably be having a linked credit card capability. It will not be using the credit card for authorization. It would simply be linking the Charge Pocket to your credit card account and taking the money from that account. And that's been currently done in conjunction with the banks. And then also we'll be looking at connecting a fleet management system in. So for those of you who have companies and are running fleet cards, those fleet services would integrate directly into the Charge Pocket app. If I quickly just open up the starting of a transaction, so if I want to start a transaction, I can basically go there, I can choose the card I want to start it on, and I can then choose the charging station that I want to go. Sorry, it's still refreshing, so I'm going to just leave that. So that gives you an idea of how that Charge Pocket app works. Once the charge session is actually running, just get back there. So once the charge session is actually running, what we can do is we can then monitor the physical actual percentage. So you can see here, it would show you how far you are with the charging session, how much money has been used, how much is left. And at this time, what you can do is you can stop the charge based on spend, based on state of charge, or based on a certain amount of kilowatt hours. So you're able to set that up and say, stop at 80% and we'll stop the charging session at 80%. This works really great for DC. On the AC side, we don't get the percentage coming back from the vehicle. So you'll see on this side is an AC charging session. So we can tell how much we've put into the vehicle, but we can't tell how full the vehicle is because that information is not communicated to the charging stations. There's many other alternative features that happen within this. So what you can do on the app is you can also ask for directions to be sent to you, and it'll be sent to your WhatsApp group. That WhatsApp message you can then forward to people if you want to work with that. You've got a map within this. That map can allow you to look at various things on the map. You can see what connectors are available at the site, and you can see what amenities are at the site, as well as what you might be paying for a particular charging session. So that brings me to the next big question that was in the from the attendees, and that was really about charging rates. What are the charging rates for vehicles, and how does it compare to fuel vehicles, for example? So the first one over there is the fossil fuel cost. So that gives you some sort of indication. I must apologize up front because I don't drive a fossil fuel vehicle. I probably should verify. I'm sure it's not 16 Rand anymore. But if it was 16 Rand, you're talking about R1.50 per kilometer. If you look at the cost of charging on public charging, it's about 2/3 of the price of fuel. So about R1 a kilometer. And I think that's a good average. I know recently there was a EV driver that drove along the N2 and he came out an average of 91 cents and, well, 91.6 cents. And I know when I did a long trip down to Cape Town and all the way back to Pretoria about 4 months ago, I also got an average of 92 cents. But that's now, both of those were done with R3s. So I think that should give you some indication. And that's real world numbers that you can see there. If you're charging at home, on a home charger, probably down as low as about 37 cents a kilometer. So about a quarter or a fifth of the price of petrol. Okay, so that gives you some indication of where those prices are. Obviously, if you move to solar, now you can really look at big savings. You can be down as low as 17 cents a kilometer, which is more or less an eighth or a tenth of the cost of what fossil fuel would be. Most people work on what we would call a blended rate. So some charging at home, some charging in the public space. And this particular scenario, the blended rate, works on a 20% in public charging assumption. So 80% at home, 20% in public. And you can see that gives you rates of about 44 cents a kilometer or 34 cents a kilometer with solar. The actual rate per kilowatt hour is normally determined by the owner of the charging station. So there's no particular guidance on this. GridCars has a particular view. We charge 588 for DC chargers and 470 for AC chargers, but we've certainly seen amounts that have been that are lower than that by other people who own charging equipment. And then also a lot of the OEMs may offer discounted rates. So some of the OEMs would negotiate specific rates and based on various mechanisms, and that would then give a discount to some of the drivers of a particular rate. So when you buy a car, one of the questions you should be asking is, what specials are there? What are the rates that I get? What is my charging rate with this vehicle when I'm charging? So it gives you some sort of idea of where those numbers are. But it is a free market. These numbers will move around as more players start to enter into that market. All right, so the last poll that we're going to be doing is really just around when would you buy a car? So if you own a car, that's fine. There's an option. If you don't own a car, then you need to give us some ideas there. So if you don't mind completing that one for us, that'll give us some indication of when we think they'll go. And I'll ask Mornay at the end of all of this to just maybe run through each of the polls quickly and tell us where what happened with the various polls that we took. The last two slides to just give you a quick view. This is a concept station that was built in the UK, or at least was defined in the UK. I'm sure everybody has seen this. It was called GridServe. There are great pictures on the internet showing what they're planning and how a dedicated charging station would look. And if you look very carefully and you blink, you'll see this is how it becomes real. And this is a real charging station. And I think this is important. We are no longer just talking about graphics drawings and ideas. We're talking about real world stuff happening. The tech is on the ground, the vehicles are coming. We can drive anywhere in South Africa. We can use vehicles on holidays. There is absolutely no reason for anybody to have range anxiety, unless it's self-induced. Some people do want to play to the edge of the thing, and it's great when you see 2 kilometers left on your thing and you arrived at the charging station, but there is no reason for range anxiety. If you plan your trips properly, there are charging stations pretty broadly across the country. And more than that, I think there are many people working to be able to expand the network and make it possible for everybody to be able to drive and go all across the country and into all the different areas. So thank you so much for listening to this part of the talk. I'm going to hand over to Mornay and just ask him to maybe run us through the results of the actual forums. I think they are published on the chat, but I haven't been looking, so I don't see that. So I'm going to ask Mornay just to quickly give us a little bit around that.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Winston. All right, so this is interesting. So I think the first one is, have you ever done an EV road trip? And there was some discussion that in chat as well that we'll get to. So it seems like the highest result was 37 from people owning EVs, 37% only driving within 150 kilometer range. That's sort of a full charge distance that you would get to your destination and back. So not really doing a massive Cape Town or Durban trip. And then it seems that around 11% has done 2,000 kilometers and 6% has done over 4,000. So that's quite interesting to see. So there's definitely been a few people who have driven Cape Town and Durban routes. The next one is where should we install next? I think that one we'll publish a little bit later. It's quite a diverse thing, but I think the biggest one that we saw was that people want to, this chat keeps updating. So people want to see at Richmond 42%, which we definitely understand. And then for the other routes, it seems quite evenly spread between Port Alfred, Kimberley, Uppington. So everyone wants to see those gaps a little bit more filled. When we go to when we will about buying an EV, already having one, the highest result there was they will buy an EV in the next 2 to 5 years. 22% answered that. And 14% say they have an EV, but they still drive in fossil fuel. That's cool to see. Cool, but those results are available there in the conversation for everyone to see. Should we roll over to the Q&A session?
Yes, I think if there's any questions and you're probably picking them up, you're welcome to shoot, and let's see if we can answer some.
Cool stuff. So I think when we now discussed about the route and stuff, there was quite a lot of discussion. A lot of people liked it about doing some EV road trip adventure, basically, but organizing a fleet of EVs going down in a session. So just your thoughts on that, and if we can perhaps initiate something like that, and how many people are actually sharing their road trips on Facebook already.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant idea. In fact, I think we should not delay. We if you feel that there's something happening, if you want to go out to, let's say, to one of the smaller towns close by, let's say Caledon, and I'm now talking Pretoria, and you put it on Facebook and challenge people, meet us out at Caledon, this is where we're going. You might be there on your own, but at the same time, you might be there with 10 or 20 friends. So yeah, I think we absolutely have to do it. I know there are some plans in the pipeline for some bigger trips. So trips down to Cape Town, there's some discussions around that. And, we did a road trip recently into Drakensberg, and I know the group that I went with there was very keen to organize a few more and start to spread that more broadly as well. So yes, really exercise the route. I think it's brilliant. That's what we've got to be doing.
Awesome. There's a question here from Dario, which I think I'm interpreting correctly, but I think it's sort of encouraging EV drivers to be promoting the need for charging so that we can get more opportunistic sales of charge points. So when you're in an area and you need to charge somewhere where there's not a charge point, see if you can engage with others in the area to, if there's especially a solar, there's a garage with solar power and stuff, absolutely. Engaging with them to say, I need a charge point here, perhaps think about it, that type of thing.
It's a very good question, and I think one of the things that I do a lot, and I know a lot of my friends that drive EVs do exactly the same, and that is when you stop at a place, even if you don't intend or don't really need to charge, make the people aware at the site that you're there with an EV. Because so often we go and talk to a site about installing a charger, and they say, but why? Nobody ever comes here with an EV. Whereas I think the idea is that we're not making them aware that there are drivers with EVs, and if there was a charger, we would probably have used it. So we need to start to make the people aware of it and talk about it and say, this is what we want. And when there are good locations, if you go you stop at a shopping center, you think it's a brilliant location, be vocal about it. Send a picture on Facebook and say, wouldn't it be nice if I could be charging my EV here when I'm stopped at, and take a photo and put it on Facebook. The more will be happy because you're going to get them some PR and marketing, but at the same time, it gets that message out there that we are out there, we're looking for charging, we want to be there. And when you go to a charging site where there is a charger, do the same. So take a picture of the charger, put it on Facebook, talk about it, that people know that these chargers are out there and that the network is available. For me, it's really, really important that we drive that message.
Awesome. I'm going to skip the questions about the charge point locations for a while so I can group them all together later. I was just wondering if you can chat a bit, Winston, about the differences between Charge Pocket's live map and the info you get, GridCars live map, and then other platforms such as PlugShare and so on, of the differences and the benefits.
Yeah. So at this stage, the best map that you're going to see in terms of actual locations and accuracy of information will definitely be within Charge Pocket. And the only reason for that is that it's a live updated map. If we update, that information is done live. If you look at things like PlugShare, they've got great mechanisms for determining your trip and planning your trip and looking at where you're going to go and how you're going to go. But the charge points are often captured by the public in general. Most of them very accurate because it's EV drivers, but every now and again we find chargers that aren't really there, that it was more captured because somebody thought there was supposed to be a charger there but didn't actually have it. Right now, the GridCars system does not update to PlugShare, but there are discussions that are happening around that and just around how that data would be managed to move it onto there. We're also looking at getting it published within Google, same challenge. All of these guys have got very strict protocols when you're pushing bulk data onto these platforms. So we're busy working with them now to understand how we would be moving that data onto the things. Most of the vehicles in South Africa already have the mapping integrated into the vehicles. So, if you're looking at any of the new EVs in the country, they would typically be having data fed directly from us, or potentially indirectly, but through one of the other sources, but then onto their mapping system. So if you're driving around and you search on the maps, you should be able to find the charging stations as well.
100. There's a few questions coming through about not finding ChargePocket on Google Play Store or Apple Store. And I think from my side, I can just address that. ChargePocket is a web application. So when you do register for ChargePocket, you save it as if it's an application on your mobile phone, as Winston has demonstrated.
Now, over time, we will look at building platform-specific charging apps, but at this point, it's as Monet said, it's a web app, and it is fully cross-platform, so it works on all devices and all systems.
Winston,
it would be easier to use. Thank you, and it's certainly on our radar as something that we need to look at doing.
Winston, I wonder if you can just perhaps give a brief view of how do you register for ChargePocket if you now buy your EV. Just a short brief of where to just get started, perhaps, and then contacting us for more information.
So I think, firstly, if you have an EV and you're just out of the blue need to suddenly register because you haven't registered yet, that's great. The easiest way would be to go to activecharge.co.za, and you'll find a register link there, and you can just register online there. However, all the OEMs do have links specific to that OEM. So if you buy a BMW, you'll get a BMW onboarding link, and that link would ask you certain information. And based on how you've applied that, put that information in, you would then be able to get the benefits offered by that OEM, whether they pay for membership, whether they give you some sort of discount on the things, but you've got to go via the OEM specific link. It normally comes with the card. So if you collect a card at a dealership, the card will come like a bank card. It'll come in an envelope, and that envelope inside there would tell you the full details of that. But it really is as simple as opening up a link, or scanning a QR code, or clicking on a button if it's depending on which website you're at, and from there completing 4 or 5 fields, and you're in on the ChargePocket application.
Awesome. Winston, I couldn't unfortunately not see you asked the question, so I can't address them specifically. But there was a question about, are there any plans on linking with the BMW Charge Now network? So I do think it's important to explain the roaming agreement and that we are the Charge Now.
Absolutely, yeah. So the BMW network is available on Active Charge, and the Active Charge stations, or the GridCars charge stations, is available on the BMW network. So there is a roaming agreement between GridCars and BMW. So you will see sharing of charging technology, and it is very transparent. We have seen people say, yeah, but what about the one card working on all networks? It is already like that. One card does work on all networks. It just so happens that sometimes people are a bit more fussy about what they view, and without naming companies, a particular OEM may not want to show another OEM's dealership on his map, for example. Now, I know as an EV driver, you want to see everything, and that's why we encourage you to see everything, to go to Active Charge for now. But most of the OEMs are starting to collaborate and build roaming agreements between the OEMs with constraints and rules as to how that's going to work.
So I see there's a question. So will Jaguar card work on the BMW charger?
So at this stage, the Jaguar card will work on the BMW charger, but the actual charge station will not show on the Jaguar map.
Awesome. There's a question that came in with the new EVs that are coming in. Will GridCars be partnering with Volvo, Audi, and Mercedes?
I can say confidently at this stage, yes, definitely on one of them. Well, sorry, on 2, and very likely on the 3rd.
Awesome. There was just some other suggestions, naming that perhaps a SnapScan method to be added to ChargePocket payment options. We'll look into that. I suppose it's just linking the. We'll look into that. But there was also a question: do we plan to in the future load your credit card for ChargePocket app for post billing? So you charge first and then build.
Yes,
I suppose
it is, and that's the discussions currently happening with the banks, because there's got to be a pre-authorization clearance that we request from the credit card companies, and that's got quite an implication in terms of how we implement that. So that is happening, and hopefully by early next year we should see you being able to use your credit card as part of a post-billing system on the systems. But we certainly will not move towards scanning the credit card, just very simply because we're moving away from cards in general.
Okay. I see here Dario just also added onto I think that discussion about the opportunistic charging as well, that he'll be happy to share his charge point being available for people if you're in the area. I think that's exactly what PlugShare is designed to do, but perhaps you can also consider how to add PlugShare type of sharing on our network as well.
Absolutely, we can definitely do that, Dario. So just drop us a message and we'll get in contact with you, and we'll get it visible on the GridCars networks, and we can publish it as long as it meets the criteria. We can publish it into the vehicle maps as well, wherever we have access.
Awesome, thank you, Dario. I think as a last question to wrap up our time, just about Mr. Robert asked, when do you expect the government to address import duties on EVs and incentives? That's a big question, I suppose, on everyone's question radar.
I suppose I can say personally, I expected them to deal with it in 2009 already. So, yeah, I don't know. I think if we have heard rumors, and I'm going to call them rumors because that there are things happening, and this being October, being Transport Month, I think there's some hope that maybe we'll hear something. But really, I know there's been a lot more in-depth discussions between NAAMSA and the government. I think the government has got a much better understanding of the implications of that either way, and hopefully we'll see some proper movements over the next few months. But it's really not based on any knowledge other than hearing people talking within the industry.
All right, I think that wraps up our webinar for today. There are some questions that we'll respond to everyone individually, like Dario saying that we should chat and that type of thing. So thank you everyone for your participation, and thank you, Winston, for hosting this webinar.
It's an absolute pleasure, and thank you for everybody. And just to repeat what Monet said, feel free, you can always drop us an email if you have further questions. We'll keep the channel open for a little while if you want to throw some questions onto the chat, and we will certainly work through the chat and make sure that we can get responses back to everybody. So thank you very much, and thank you, Monet.